Welcome back everybody to me talking about books and stuff. And today we're gonna slay us a straw man. Yes, so come with me, gather your torches and pitchforks, which are prime straw man dismantling tools, and also look good in a mob, and we will go and, well, dismantle traditional fantasy. Let's do that, right? Well, cheers. All right. So this is something of a follow-up to the grimdark discussion. And the reason there is that when I look at what people think grimdark is, and, look into discussions and stuff, a lot of times it gets put up as this antithesis, this reaction to traditional fantasy. And I always wondered, what do people mean by traditional fantasy? Because you'll hear it now. There is no such thing as traditional fantasy. There is no tradition in fantasy. There is multiple traditions within the field of fantastic literature. And we'll talk about that now. But there's no such thing as a monolithic traditional fantasy. And I'll try to explain all of that today. So I guess we'll do that now. So yeah, I did ask on Twitter what people thought traditional fantasy books and authors were. And I got a few replies. Obviously not too many, because not too many people follow me on Twitter and I'm not very active there. So, this is a very small sample size here. But nevertheless, I want to look at what they do and what names were dropped there and how that, maybe makes sense or doesn't make sense. And then I'll look into how I see the field of fantasy has evolved over the last 1.5 centuries, roughly, which is, I guess, what we need to talk about when we talk about modern fantasy. All right, let's do that. So, what were the, main answers? Who's traditional fantasy? Well, J.R.R. Tolkien gets mentioned a lot, of course, right? I mean, it's sort of the big name there. But is it? So J.R.R. Tolkien was certainly hugely influential, if only because he managed to actually make fantasy, or one specific type of fantasy, both commercially successful and critically acclaimed, or at least respectable in a way. So Tolkien was certainly very influential on the field of fantasy, at least parts of fantasy. But is J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings? Let's not forget that most people only think of Lord of the Rings, or maybe The Hobbit, but not on the Silmarillion, because everyone is like, oh, it's like the Bible, which it is not. But yeah. And I would call what J.R.R. Tolkien does mythological fantasy, or myth-based fantasy, or myth-influenced fantasy. And we'll come back to that in a little. So let's put a pin into that. So who else gets mentioned? Well, C.S. Lewis got mentioned, which is fine. He's a friend of J.R.R. Tolkien's and kind of gets lumped into that, even though I suspect not that many people have actually read Narnia and just watched the first movie and liked the line because he was kind of fluffy and cute and really boring. But, we see that one mentioned. Someone else mentioned Stephen R. Donaldson, and that kind of surprised me, because if there's one thing I know about Stephen Donaldson and the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, which I still haven't read, just started once, is that Stephen Donaldson is very actively writing against or subverting, or in other ways dealing with, the type of mythological fantasy J.R.R. Tolkien was writing, specifically The Lord of the Rings, in a lot of, ideas that he propounds. And looking at some of the later stuff he seems to have written, there's certainly people who consider Stephen Donaldson very much dark, if not grimdark, and other things. I'll point once again to one of the articles that are linked within Joe Abercrombie's article on grimdark that I recently posted in the video description. So go and look at what people write about Stephen Donaldson there. Point is, not exactly what I would call the same thing as Lord of the Rings. Now, someone else mentioned Robert E. Howard. And you know what? That makes a lot of sense, because Robert E. Howard and Conan the Barbarian is certainly a huge influence on the fantasy field. He even wrote, or at least published his stuff before J.R.R. Tolkien. But is Robert E. Howard, traditional fantasy? Is Conan traditional fantasy? I don't know. Some people call it sword and sorcery for a reason. The reason being that Fritz Leiber had a good idea for a name later on. But yeah, so I would say there's huge differences between what Howard does and what J.R.R. Tolkien does. And lumping both together in the same field broadens the field to something that makes, makes calling it traditional fantasy. Basically, everything with swords, sorcery, weird creatures, and, everything between Christian allegory and existentialist toxic masculinity is apparently fantasy at this point. Nevertheless, Howard is part of a specific tradition of fantasy. The one that I would call adventure fantasy, or adventure-based fantasy. And I'll get back to that in a minute as well. And then someone mentioned the Chronicles of Amber. And don't get me wrong, I love the Chronicles of Amber. You can go back like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and you'll find me talking about some of the Chronicles of Amber books by Roger Zelazny and loving them. However, are the Chronicles of Amber very much like what happens in sword and sorcery stories, in adventure-based fantasy stories like the ones written by Robert E. Howard or Fritz Leiber or Clark Ashton Smith or many of the other authors that follow that specific trajectory and tradition? Of course not. But are the Chronicles of Amber very much like, say, Lord of the Rings and other myth-based fantasy? I don't think so. They're about a family, a squabbling family of egomaniacs with all kinds of psychological issues, very explicitly and deliberately mentioned as such. They're also jumping from universe to universe, from world to world. It's world hopping. It takes place partly in our time. It is a lot of things. But it sure is another and different tradition from what Robert E. Howard does and what J.R.R. Tolkien does. Does it reference the other two, or is aware of the other two? Of course it is, because, Roger Zelazny wrote this in like the 1970s, and we can assume that he had read at least one or two pulp stories by one of the big ones like Howard, Ashton Smith, or maybe even Lovecraft. We can probably also assume that he has, was aware of, J.R.R. Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings, I guess, that we can take that as read. So yeah, is that traditional fantasy? Well, it's 50 years old. If that's your term for tradition, then yeah, it's traditional fantasy, but it's very much a different thing than the other things that we just mentioned. It is, in fact, a different tradition that I would call I would put other authors into that one as well, like, say, Michael Moorcock, who was sadly not mentioned by anyone that I asked, which is a grave oversight, and will remedy the whole lack of Elric appreciation real soon, I promise you that. But yeah, it is a very character-focused psychological fantasy. We'll see influences like that show up in all kinds of later books as well. And as I said, it's a third tradition of fantasy out there. Now, someone obviously mentioned the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, and however you pronounce that, man, a thing by Aeneas, written about Aeneas by Virgil, and all kinds of things like that. And that's funny. I wouldn't call it fantasy literature, but it certainly is mythology, or it certainly partakes of similar elements. I'm just shocked that no one mentioned the Bible in there. Probably didn't dare to, but that was fun. But it's not part of contemporary or modern fantasy literature, which we are talking about here. Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast was not mentioned, but it's certainly old and it's fantastic, and it's all kinds of other things besides. Well, someone mentioned Wheel of Time, and I don't know. That's a weird one. We'll talk about what Wheel of Time tries to do, and we can see if that is traditional fantasy or not. Well, it's not. It's certainly aware of certain traditions within the fantasy genre and uses them to further the to further the genre, which is what most art does. Dragonlance got mentioned, or Forgotten Realms. Are they traditional fantasy? Well, in a specific form, yes. They are Dungeons and Dragons based fantasy. They are adventure based fantasy in that regard. And they are, at heart, or were at the beginning at least, tools for tactical studies rules, TSR, to sell their role-playing game products. They have moved beyond that in a lot of ways, but that's what they were at the beginning. And they are thus certainly another tradition, the game-based fantasy, which has connections to the adventure-based fantasy. We'll look at that in a moment as well. But they're also not the specific traditional fantasy. Because trust me, between the Dark Elf and Dragons of Autumn's, whatever the first one was in that original Dragonlance, Autumn Twilight, whatever, something like that, the first novel of Dragonlance, whatever they are, they're certainly not like Lord of the Rings, even though they take elements from that. They're also not like Conan and the Barbarian. For one, Driz doesn't have the balls of Conan, for example. And the combat is more realistic when Howard writes it. Are they like Zelazny's Amber? No, of course not. There's like no psychological depth in any of those, but you know what I mean. So they're their own thing out there as well, following specific rules and constraints by their specific tradition of game-based and adventure game-based fantasy. But they're not traditional fantasy. All right, there we are with most of the names that got dropped there on, fantasy, what people think traditional fantasy is. I may have, missed one, forgotten one, because I'm, inventing this thing whole cloth right now and improvising. But yeah, let's look at a brief history of contemporary fantasy, how those different traditions come to be, interact, and form that ongoing river that is fantasy. And then we'll see that there is no such thing as traditional fantasy. All right. In the beginning, there were people making up words. No, seriously. I want to look at the end of the 19th century, and we can see certain roots of the genre come from there. Like the 19th century, in a lot of ways, is interesting and important for what we see in contemporary fantasy. They are an age or a time of rediscovery of mythology, of reformulation of fantasy, of mythologies, of traditions, and the creating of new myths in a lot of ways. They're the time of like the really expansive historical novels and the weird parts creeping in when you read Edgar Bulwer-Lytton, which maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. But he certainly was someone who brought like elements of the fantastic, of the imaginary into the historical novel in a way. And that's a wonderful thing. And yeah, if you want to read The Coming Race, that's like right up there for like really weird conspiracy theories. It's also not that good a book, but other books by Bulwer-Lytton are certainly, worth reading if you're into like really plodding 19th century historical novels, which, maybe some of you are. But you also have similar books written in German at the time. The Battle for Rome by Felix Dahn is like the classic example for that. It's a historical novel about Goths invading Rome and, the western part of the Roman Empire dying, failing and being reconquered by everyone's favorite Eastern Roman Empire and apparently vampire Justinian. It's also really plodding and does a lot of weird things, and it shows something that we see with that rediscovery of history that is so tightly connected to mythology in a lot of ways, and that is the nationalism. I've spoken about that with Philip Chase, and we can see it in like all kinds of cultures at the time. We have Finland, we have Elias Lönnrot going out and collecting mythologies for the Kalevala, which you definitely should go and read, if only for the most epic mic drop in mythology and history, and a lot of other things. We have people collecting tales and customs in the Celtic world, in Ireland, in Wales, wherever in the British Isles, and mostly getting it wrong and imagining new stuff. We have the rising of the Irish national romantic movement, with a turning back to like ideas like fairies and stuff with William Butler Yeats, for example. And we have all of these things bubbling from the late 19th century into the early 20th century. It's also the rise of modern occultism with the Order of the Golden Dawn and all kinds of others that take these things further into, to put it mildly, LARPing Bill Lytton, I guess, and others. But, the rise of magic and irrationality in that regard. And we have a lot of writers connected to that. We have Arthur Machen, whom you definitely should go and read for his more like horror and darker fantasy adventure stories. He's a huge influence on people like H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard and more. And yeah, he's worth reading. We have people like Lord Dunsany coming up with more like fairy tale based fantasy stories and poems. You should go and read Lord Dunsany, The King of Elfland's Daughter. It's a classic, and rightly so. And then we have finally that other big influence there, which is the Worm Ouroboros, which Tolkien has acknowledged as an influence for him. So we have all of that happening at the same time. We have the rise of popular magazines that tell stories, that collect stories. So we have a market for actual writers being paid to write stories, which is something we haven't really had in like the 18th, 17th, or whenever century. Professional writing as a career becomes something viable at the end of the 19th century in a lot of ways. Well, in the 19th century, and it moves into the 20th century in a lot of ways. So I guess we come to that really big age-like era of fantasy, and that is the 30s and 40s for all kinds of reasons, where a lot of these traditions kind of start or, reach a broader audience. And that is, on the one hand, the era of the pulp magazines, with writers like Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard. There's so many more at the time, right? And all of them, write their basically adventure stories, often like horror-tinged adventure stories, because the Gothic novel is something that we have obviously also taken from the 19th century. They mix those kind of things and write short stories that are marketed to a broad audience in like the 1930s with magazines like Weird Tales. And that's one of the traditions of fantasy at the time, right? Is these adventure-based stories, because they are mostly adventure stories with a supernatural cast to it. You look at the stories, they are short stories of a hero or a group of heroes doing something, breaking into a castle, a tomb, a temple, or whatever, stealing something valuable, or facing down an impossible monster, or chasing someone and maybe finding them or whatever. But they're adventure stories. They could happen in our world with less magic. And famously, people like Robert E. Howard wrote like classical adventure stories as well. The Elborak adventures are completely free of the supernatural, or more or less completely free of the supernatural, and they are basically the same structure. And that's what I call like adventure-based fantasy. And as I said, writers like Arthur Machen are certainly a huge influence of that. On that, obviously Edgar Allan Poe is a huge influence on the more horror side of things there. Although even Poe wrote weird adventure stories. If you want to find out about one, then read Arthur Gordon Pym. That one is weird, to put it mildly. And stuff like that. And that tradition, moves on for a long time. And at the same time, we start with the other tradition, what I call mythologically or myth-based fantasy. And that is certainly Tolkien and up to a point C.S. Lewis. They look at mythologies, that rediscovery of mythology that I just spoke about in the 19th century, the re-evaluation of sagas, of poems and stories like Beowulf, of Norse mythology that we have seen with the rise of the Romantics in the 19th century, the rediscovery of, or like the evaluation or changing and reinterpretation of Norse mythology by someone like Richard Wagner. Those things are huge influences on someone like Tolkien, and he looks at other authors that come before him, like William Morris, that Philip Chase is so fond of quoting, and Eddings, is that the name of the guy who wrote The War of Robbers? I'm just not good with names right now. And those people already did something that Tolkien also does. They take ideas of mythology and then they write their own mythology or mythologically or myth-based stories, invent mythologies that follow the same kind of rules, the same kind of story structure that mythology often follows. And Tolkien does the same thing, and C.S. Lewis does the same thing as well by, basing it on one of the most popular mythologies out there, that being Christian religion. And, retelling Christian allegories in a fantastical realm with lots of talking animals, which may or may not be your thing. And we follow that, basically. And it becomes more popular through the fact that, people like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien are respected outside of the small circle of people that read pulps, or not a small circle, but, outside the circles that read pulp stories, which, Conan stuff is certainly marketed to a younger and less academic audience. They're like for the broad masses, so to speak. We still have like a fairly, class differences are a huge thing in the 1930s, 1940s, apart from all the other bad stuff happening at the same time. But yeah. My point is, we have these people that come from a very different background, and they create mythologies, and while still, frowned upon by some of their academic peers, they certainly gain a level of respectability that Howard or Lovecraft don't have. They have like actual book publishers. They publish long stories, mythologies, like Lord of the Rings is 3 volumes. They market it to a different audience, and they follow that path into the future. It leads to someone like Philip Pullman going and writing The Golden Compass and Historic Materials, which certainly is a reaction in a way to what C.S. Lewis does from a more atheist perspective. But it still struggles with that idea of like dealing with mythologies and the big questions of our, past in that regard. And in the meantime, we have the perpetuation of the adventure stories, of the sword and sorcery stories through the 30s, 40s, 50s by people like Fritz Leiber, who start writing at the end of the 30s, but continue writing stories into the 1980s, like early 80s when he dies. And over time, their style changes, their ideas change, and their stories move on. But that's where the basis for that is. And we have new writers coming into the field, like one Michael Moorcock, who's very much a child of the 60s and 70s in that regard, who really does not like Lord of the Rings for a lot of reasons, and starts writing fantastical stories in a multiverse with a psychologically nuanced character that is looked at through a psychological lens, because it's a new academic discipline at the time. He does that, and it's called, Elric of Melniboné and the Eternal Champion myth and a first multiverse. We have Roger Zelazny, who does a very similar thing, and yet very different, with the Chronicles of Amber in the 1970s. And they are what I call that, character-driven. They put the character front and center in that regard, and have an actual character play the main role in the story in that regard. And we move further on into the 70s and have more of that stored. And we have the advent of Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games, who are mostly influenced by playing adventures, and thus have a huge influence from the adventure side of fantasy. The Robert E. Howards and Fritz Leibers. We find the Thieves Guild from Lonkmar basically transported into every D&D setting ever. We have a lot of people who want to play Conan and, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, or even Kugel the Clever. They want to play thieves and warriors, and maybe also wizards, which is probably the biggest contribution that Lord of the Rings and J.R.R. Tolkien do to have on the Dungeons and Dragons setting, is the idea that people can actually play wizards, if you don't attribute that one to Jack Vance, but can actually play wizards and not just fight them, which is usually what sword and sorcery heroes do. And a game follows another rules. It follows all kinds of constraints because it has to be fun to play, not fun to watch or fun to read. And the stories that are told at the gaming table are, while still adventure stories, kind of different from the ones that we have read before. And we will see that when the game-driven fantasy starts with, becomes really popular with Dragonlance and the Forgotten Realms stories. We suddenly have an adventure party that has those classic roles of the game: the wizard, the warrior, the thief, the ranger, those archetypes that Philip Chase and AP Canavan have looked at so in that wonderful series of theirs. We have all of that now moving forward, but it is always built on all these different strains that come before. We have, like in the late 70s, we have Donaldson writing his first book, Lord Foul's Bane. We have Glenn Cook in 1984 writing The Black Company. We have all these aspects out there. I kind of forgot to mention Ursula K. Le Guin, who does her Wizard of Earthsea series, which, while certainly somewhat akin, at least the first one, to what Tolkien does, what C.S. Lewis does do so through a very different political lens, a more left-wing anarchist lens, in the case of Ursula K. Le Guin, a more feminist lens, having female protagonists, having all kinds of, psychological lenses in there as well, but still that somewhat dreamy, mythic tone, at least with the first Wizard of Earthsea story. All of that stuff is moving forward and obviously influencing each other because people have read other stories. They incorporate what they find, but they're also all over the place. There's really dark stuff out there. As I said, Lord Foul's Bane famously starts with a leper committing rape. I mean, that's pretty grimdark, if you ask me. But, there's stuff like that. We have, in all these different aspects moving around into, the late 80s. And that's when, Wheel of Time starts, which is sort of the connecting issue there. We have, before that, of course, we have Ted Williams' love letter to classic fantasy in the more myth-driven mold that is Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, which does tell a basically fantasy story that is relying heavily on, ideas like coziness of nature, something that we find a lot of in Tolkien's Shire and other parts of Tolkien's writing. It also has some elements of, our world-based cultures, Vikings, well, they're not called Vikings, but you know what I mean. Stuff like that you can maybe also trace a bit to stuff like Robert E. Howard. But it's very much one of the first, fantasy trilogies that follows the mold of Lord of the Rings in that regard, in, the 1980s. And we have, obviously, The Sword of Shannara, which famously is very much a copy of Lord of the Rings in its plot. But it's also in, the 1980s. So the idea that traditional fantasy is the trilogy of a small farm boy going out and doing something amazing and saving the world as a tradition is something that got picked up again in the 1980s, 30 years after J.R. Tolkien wrote his Lord of the Rings. And between that time, in those 30 years, everything was around and possible. So calling those books traditional fantasy is something of a misnomer, isn't it? So we come to Wheel of Time. Wheel of Time is, sets out, clearly influenced both by Robert E. Howard's writings, because, Robert Jordan was famously writing Conan pastiches before he wrote this book. And it's also very much influenced by Lord of the Rings, and it combines those two, the adventure-driven fantasy and the myth-driven fantasy of J.R. Tolkien, so Howard's and Tolkien's ideas in a lot of ways, and moves them into a slightly more gritty world where where a world that feels alive because there's actually people out there. They're not, as well rendered as in later fantasies like A Game of Thrones, like A Song of Ice and Fire, and beyond that, where suddenly the world really feels alive. But Jordan was aware of that idea that the world should have more than just our main characters, like a lot of have the stable hands, have the servants, have the farmers, have all those people actually feel real and alive. And that's one of the big contributions that Jordan and the Wheel of Time does to fantasy in that regard. His characters are obviously fairly, I would say, oscillating between good and bad in a lot of ways. They're not as psychologically rounded as, Zelazny's Amber characters or Moorcock's Elric characters, even less than, say, stuff that people like Glenn Cook do. He's not that kind of writer, though, and he's writing something else there. But is it traditional fantasy? Well, it's certainly successful fantasy, but that's not the same thing as traditional. And that brings us to like the year 2000 or thereabouts, when we have that explosion of gritty fantasy that clearly pays homage to, say, Lord of the Rings. We have an entire battle that's basically Helm's Deep, but with more blood and guts in the second or the third First Law book, The Battle in the High Places, which is very much inspired by what Tolkien does. It is built on that. It is subverting Tolkien, just like Donaldson did back in the day. It is subverting the traditional Northern barbarian, what your Robert E. Howard did in his story, just like others did before, just like Elric is already subverting that. So what can we learn from all of this? Fantasy literature, like every form of literature, is an ongoing stream. And it has all kinds of internal, smaller schools, traditions, oftentimes because writers are friends with each other and talk to each other. Famously, Howard and Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Fritz Leiber even exchanged letters. They wrote to each other. They were friends. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were friends and exchanged letters, and we can read them. Later on, Roger Zelazny was friends with George R. R. Martin and Neil Gaiman and a lot of other people, and they were playing role-playing games together, even writing together. That's how fantasy has always been, a ongoing stream, almost a river of stories, influences, ideas, ways of doing things, oftentimes tied together by groups of friends that do the same thing and exchange ideas and influence each other and push each other forward. And it's always built on the things that come before, played on them, paid homage to them, subverted them where people felt they were no longer appropriate ideas, and so on. It's always happened, but it certainly does not lend itself to saying one specific tradition of this ongoing stream of fantasies, traditional fantasy, and the others are not, because that's just not how it works. They're all traditional fantasy, including Game of Thrones at this point. It's very much traditional fantasy at this point because it has influenced so much. even Joe Abercrombie is slowly joining the tradition of fantasy by just being out there for like 20 years now. That makes you traditional fantasy. It's just like how this works. So yeah, let's wrap this up. I've given you a long story on how fantasy became fantasy, or like how I think broadly the 20th century fantasy traditions have formed. And the point of this was to show that all of these are interacting with each other, have always done so. And there's no such thing as traditional fantasy. And on the other hand, there's something like grimdark fantasy. It's all part of the same. It's all part of the same river. It's just a different, school joining the conversation. And it's built on a lot of those things that have come before that we consider, older fantasy. Anyway, my point was to show it's more nuanced. There's no such thing as that definite distinction between traditional fantasy and contemporary fantasy, or traditional fantasy and grimdark, or grimdark and not so grimdark. It just doesn't exist. And how do you find out all about that? Well, go and read some classics. Go and read some Robert E. Howard. Go and read Tolkien. Don't only just watch the movie. Read Lord of the Rings. It'll help. Go read some Jack Vance. Read some Elric. For God's sake, go and read some Elric and read some Gormenghast. Really, more people need to do that, just like Jack Vance. There's so much out there to discover. And bashing one of those fields because you have built a strawman of traditional fantasy that has never existed in that way, at the end of the day, it's impoverishing you as a reader if you just ignore that stuff. Try it out. Find out what you really like. And I promise you, it'll probably be more than you think. Anyway, have a great day. Cheers.